Hello. Welcome to today's webinar. We will get started in just a minute. Thank you for joining today's webinar. Emotions Matter for All Learners, SEL for traditionally underserved students and educators. Both Harmony and Inspire host these webinars where thought leaders and educators share best teaching practices and tools to support social emotional learning. These presentations are the opinions and content of our guest speakers and may not necessarily be a direct representation of Harmony or Inspire. For best viewing of this webinar, it's recommended that you shut down your other browsers. Please use the question box on your GoToWebinar control panel to submit questions, comments, or ponderings for our guest. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and you'll receive a copy of the recording within the next week. If you are watching this webinar live, you will receive a copy of certificate of participation from GoToWebinar within 48 hours. You can also download a copy of the slide deck today under the Handout tab on your GoToWebinar panel. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Christina Cipriano, PhD, is an assistant professor at the Yale Child Study Center and Director of Research at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. Dr. Cipriano's research focuses on the systemic implementation and assessment of social and emotional learning, SEL, to promote pathways to optimal development outcomes for traditionally marginalized student or educator populations. Chris is a first-generation high school graduate, a Jack Kent Cook Scholar, and the mother of 4 beautiful children who inspire her each day to take the moon and make it shine for everyone. Welcome, Dr. Cipriano. We're thrilled to have you here today.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for the warm welcome.
In today's presentation, Dr. Cipriano will share the importance of SEL and emotions and provide diverse strategies that we can use to support all students. Harmony provides diverse tools, strategies, and resources at no cost that intentionally address the 5 SEL competencies. Before we start with our fabulous presentation, we wanted to start the conversation today with a quick connection card, which, as you know, we use to build community in our Harmony classrooms. Dr. Cipriano, what is the bravest thing you have ever done?
Thank you so much for asking, Amanda, and thank you all for being here today. So October is Wellness Month, but it also is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And the bravest thing that I have ever done is separate myself and survive an abusive relationship. I share that with you all today as one of the first times that I'm speaking publicly about this. It has been a long healing journey. And at the conclusion of this webinar, I'm going to be sharing a link to resources about all of the great content we'll be covering today. And I'm also going to be including a link for others who may find this as a moment of inspiration to look at their life and recognize that there's an opportunity for change. I want to say to all of the men and women out there that you always have an option. And I could have never imagined the warmth and love in my life that I have now at that time. So wishing you all the very, very best and hoping that you're finding this is a moment to make the change you need in your life. So thank you so much, Amanda.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Cipriano, for sharing that deeply personal experience.
Thank you.
Now that we know a bit more about Dr. Cipriano, you can see how this is a great way to build rapport with our community, just with one question that can be used in any setting, in a classroom or at a staff meeting. Wow, with that great, powerful kickoff, we turn it over to you, Dr. Cipriano.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And thank you all for listening. Well, you've gotten to know quite a bit about me pretty quickly. I would love to know a little bit more about you and who's here. So let's go ahead and open that poll. and see who's joined us live this morning/afternoon.
All right, thank you. So you should see on your screen who is in our audience today: educator, administrator, nonprofit leader, out-of-school youth provider, or other. So feel free and select the best answer, or you can answer in the question box as well if you are in that other category. We'll give you a minute to respond.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Could you let me know what we're seeing in our results?
Yes, they're coming in. Well, we have about 68% vote. Okay, let's go ahead and close the poll and we'll see the results here. Terrific. 53% are educators today, 8% are administrators, 4% nonprofit leaders, 9% out-of-school youth providers, and 26% other. And in the other category, we hear from social workers, counselors, YMCA, school psychologists, human resource providers, middle school counselors, SEL coach, an elementary school counselor. Such a great diverse group today. Thank you all for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much for all coming today. Where I'll be talking about why emotions matter for all of our learners and social emotional learning for traditionally underserved students and educators, and particularly with emphasis on why this topic matters now, arguably more than ever before. So we talked a little bit about the objectives, so let's get right into it. What is it, right? Social and emotional learning, or SEL, refers to an interrelated set of cognitive, affective, behavioral competencies. They underscore our capacity to learn, develop and maintain mutually supportive relationships, and our ability to be healthy, both physically and psychologically. At the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, where I serve as the Director of Research, so the YCEI, we use the power of emotions to create a healthier and more equitable and compassionate society, investing in today for the betterment of future generations. And we conduct research on a whole host of SEL-related approaches to support emotional intelligence and skill building. Some of you may be familiar with RULER. Our approach to SEL. RULER is an acronym for the 5 skills of emotional intelligence: recognizing, understanding, labeling, expressing, and regulating, skills that I will be referencing throughout the time in our talk today. So first, to get us started, it's important to understand a little bit about how our emotions work. So we are constantly and in real time evaluating our world and our experiences in it, right? So whether the people, the objects, the interactions are good or bad, if it's relevant to us or irrelevant, maybe it's comfortable or threatening, it's novel or familiar, within our control, or consistent with or opposed to the social norms. And these experiences are termed as appraisals. So they're evaluations of our environment that are associated with a set of physiological and psychological responses that together we experience as emotion. So joy, fear, awe, excitement, even confusion. Now, these experiences of emotion are strongly related to how we make sense of and act in our world. And emotion appraisal is intimately connected to what, how, and why we understand. So as educators, and I have all educators here in the room with us, right? We can think about emotion as a process that serves to illuminate how our students are experiencing our learning environments, right? Your students, they don't just read a book. They read an exciting, an important, a trivial, a challenging, a shocking, inappropriate, uncomfortable, interesting, or easy book. The same goes for the images we use in our classrooms and our lessons, the way our physical space is set up for learning and organized, the strategies we employ, the reading level of the text we implement, the language we use, the students in our classroom, and indeed our very selves as teachers in relationship with each and every one of our students. So in this way, our students' emotions can serve as a kind of continuous formative assessment of how our students are doing in the learning environment that we are co-creating. So, for example, if a student perceives a lesson to be like too much of a challenge or have too little support, they're likely to feel anxiety. Whereas if the lesson is too little a challenge and too supportive, they might feel boredom. And you can think about it like, how have you felt when the demands of your career haven't been a match for your strengths and needs? Now, in addition, if a student doesn't see much of themselves in a lesson that reflects their own life and experiences, they may feel unwelcome, disinterested, isolated. These evaluations and closely related emotions are strongly informed by many factors, including our own backgrounds, experiences, and in culture. And in this way, emotions serve to give personal meaning to our events and actions and objects that we encounter in school, and we really see them as, I love this analogy, a useful window for teachers and educators to understand how our students experience learning. So far we've discussed the nature of an emotion as information about how our students will vary and feel in our classrooms. Now, it's important to know that students vary in how they're able to make advantageous use of emotion and social information. So let's take for a second, consider what it would be like if you were a student and you were receiving feedback on an assignment. Okay, so you're a student, you're receiving feedback on an assignment. So let's say the feedback that you receive causes you emotional discomfort. You're not sure if what the teacher is saying is good for you. Maybe you feel confused about what the teacher means, worried about your grade. How should you respond? Well, you might disengage completely. It might be overwhelmed with the discomfort of feeling that emotion. Now let's imagine instead that you take a few deep breaths. You consider your situation, you recognize that this discomfort is a signal. Now you have an opportunity to learn something new. And with this positive orientation, you look for support in your peers. You might persist listening so that you might learn from the different approaches that what did other people do in the assignment? You resolve the impasse, you revise your assignment, and you're experiencing pleasure in that achievement. Now, this student, right, in this second example, is an expert learner with regard of how to leverage EI skills in the service of a personal goal. They manage their impulses in the moment. Were motivated towards resolving the feedback. That's self-management. They cooperated with their peers and actively listened to gain insight as to how to improve their assignment, relationship skills, and they are aware of their achievement. So they're feeling positive about the work and persistence to resolve that feedback. And this is self-awareness. Now, I know it sounds so simple when we lay it out like this, but sometimes we see a student who's so socially and emotionally competent in our classrooms, it might seem as if these skills are innate or immutable. But emotional intelligence is not something that some students just have and others just do not, right? Rather, it is a set of skills that can be learned and developed. And as with any other skill, it will vary based on what is brought by the educator's efforts, right? And many factors, including their background, experience, culture, and ability. So let's quickly check in. How do you want your students to feel in your classroom? And go ahead and share, what are you thinking? How do you want them to feel in the question box? So we have the ability to create emotionally supportive conditions. How do you want your students to feel? Amanda, I can't see the question box, but can you let me know what's coming in?
Yes, it'll just take a second, but go ahead and
Great.
type your responses in the question box. We have one that's come in, safe.
Safe, thank you.
Respected and safe. Safe is coming up several times. Safe, calm and confident. Safe and seen and heard. Comfortable and safe. Relaxed, comfortable, welcome, loved, supported, accepted. happy. I want our
Wonderful.
students to feel loved and safe, challenged and valued, empowered, in charge of their own learning.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for engaging so quickly in the chat box and describing these ideal conditions for your students: safe, respected, valued, seen, loved, challenged, among others. All right, let's hold on to that on how we want our students to feel. I want to take a second to pan out to our field. So to begin, SEL is really young and malleable. With roots in prevention science, emotional intelligence, character education, the formation of CASEL put SEL on the map only in 1994, not that long ago. And accordingly, we know states are increasingly adopting SEL standards. In 2019, 87% of principals believed states should explicitly have a standard for SEL, and 39 states have at least one for their standard for their district currently. It's estimated that our schools in the US spend about $640 million annually on SEL. And it probably comes as no surprise to you, but the national prioritization in SEL in response to the COVID-19 pandemic has been significant, right? All states explicitly referencing SEL in their COVID-19 response and reopening plans. Now, despite no longer needing to convince stakeholders that SEL matters, there remains a significant discourse regarding what SEL is. So, for example, although CASEL's 5 core competencies, widely regarded as the field standard of SEL outcomes, there are 136 SEL frameworks that comprise more than 700 SEL-related competencies. Now, due in part to its interdisciplinary origins, in part to the really quick uptake, the operational definition of SEL and how to execute it with high fidelity has garnered significant attention since its inception. And there's been a lot of key questions in the discourse over the past 3 decades. You may be familiar with some of these, right? Is SEL skills another name for personality, soft skills, 21st century skills, or emotional intelligence? Are SEL skills standalone? Do they need to be taught together in a sequence? For how long does the intervention need to last to be effective? How do you assess SEL? Are SEL skills culturally responsive and universally applicable? And can SEL promote the conditions for educational equity? So towards this end, maybe you've heard the expression that to educate the whole child, you need to start with SEL. Now, I have a slight edit on this. It's been building a movement. We need to make sure we're focusing on all children in the service of the whole child, all of our children. The narrative for our students with learning differences and their education and treatment in our society is one of profound intersectionality. Race, class, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, disability, they interact, they create interlacking and overlapping systems of disadvantage for our students. And although academic underperformance among school-age children serves as a primary screener for students to qualify for special ed services, we have decades of research reporting the overrepresentation of boys and racial, ethnic, and linguistic minorities in special education classrooms. Now, historical oppression, structural racism, these further propagate these disproportionate exposures to impoverished conditions, prenatal teratogens, environmental contexts that disadvantage some of our learners just more often than others, early and often across their learning experiences. By way of definition, a learning difference is a variation in how the brain processes information, and it can affect reading and writing and math, focus, communication, following directions. Learning differences show up in your classrooms in students with a diagnosis, such as a specific learning disability like dyslexia, attention or behavioral disorders like ADHD or EBD, or in students without diagnoses who have experienced trauma or poverty, maltreatment, developmental deprivation, experiences of violence. Now, importantly, the majority of students who receive special ed services are included in general ed classrooms for most of the school day. So it is probable that most students participate in classes where SEL interventions are implemented. Yes, I said it's probable, and I'm going to get back to that a little bit later in our time together. This pandemic has been and continues to be disabling for our education system. For our teachers of students who learn and think differently, the transition to and from distance learning and navigating school years continues to present additional challenges above and beyond those faced by all. And although the ripples of the impact of this pandemic continue to unfold, what is certain is that the effects are being felt differently across every household and school community in this nation. The pandemic's disproportionate impact on Black, Indigenous, and persons of color, persons with disabilities, the elderly, its interaction with income, education, health infrastructure, has shined a bright light on current and persistent systemic inequities in our society. I have never felt more urgency to support our school communities in crisis. Our country has experienced compounding trauma in the form of racially motivated murders, police brutality, and insurrection within the context of a global pandemic that continues to disproportionately impact those who have been historically marginalized. These impacts realized throughout our policies and practices, our cultural beliefs, our values. They assert an inferiority of a certain person on the basis of race, gender, sexuality, disability, and other labeled traits. It's in essence an illusory rejection of another person's humanity. And our nation has turned its attention to SEL as the Band-Aid for the fractured system. So no pressure, right? All right, let's take a minute to check in. On a scale of 1 to 4, 1 being not important, 4 being everything, how important has SEL been to your thriving these past 19 months? We can go ahead and open that poll, 1 to 4. How important has SEL been to your thriving these past 19 months?
Go ahead and answer on your screen on a scale of 1 to 4. How important has social emotional learning been to you thriving these past 19 months? 1, not important. 2, sometimes helpful. 3, helpful. Or 4, very important. We'll give you another minute to respond, or you can respond in the question box as well.
Thank you, Amanda.
Lots of votes coming in.
Wonderful.
Everyone, about 30 more seconds here.
Thank you all for participating.
All right, let's go ahead and close the poll and see where we fall. Okay, not important, 0%. Sometimes helpful,
Wow.
7%. Helpful, 28%. Very important, 64%. And in our question box, we saw 4s across the board. So everyone sees it as, the majority see it as very important.
Wow, thank you. Thank you all for responding. You know, if there ever was a time to lean into the possibility and promise of SEL, right? It's right now. It holds promise for those who had challenges before the pandemic and those experienced by all of us currently. So we know that students who participate in SEL programs have less anxiety, perform better academically, are more attentive and less hyperactive and aggressive in school. Students with learning differences are more likely to have anxiety than their peers, are the lowest performing students and the least likely to graduate. And students with learning differences tend to have aggression challenges and have higher placement in special education classrooms. Currently, students across the country with and without differences are experiencing increased anxiety about the school, right? This is no surprise to all of you. Survey of 3,300 adolescents reported since the pandemic began, nearly 1/3 feelings of depression and anxiety. More than 1/4 of students reporting a lack of connection with their peers, teachers, and school communities. All of our students are having very difficulties attending to the different forms of remote and hybrid and in-person modalities, increased screen time, new and continuous challenging learning formats, and let's be serious, right? PPE can distract even the most attentive and adaptive student. As for our classrooms who participate in SEL are more engaged in learning, have better quality relationships between students and teachers, and have students who tend to demonstrate increased pro-sociality. Classrooms serving students with learning differences tend to report less student engagement, lower quality teacher-student relationships, and lower instances of pro-sociality. Now, we all know, right, our classroom relationships have looked and felt very differently as a result of the past 19 months and counting, right? While teachers, we've been given intimate windows into our students' home lives in some cases and some new direct access to caregivers in ways that were previously unavailable. Interactions are limited and restricted to planned encounters. Student engagement with peers was halted, right? Required complete reimagining. And simultaneously, the evolving safety precautions have never demonstrated prosociality so explicitly than they do now, with the idea that we wear a mask to protect others. And our teachers who participate in SEL programs demonstrate an increased educational efficacy, believe they make a difference in the lives of their students. Teachers tend to have improved attitudes, like their jobs, and more engagement with peers and parents. Now, educational efficacy and well-being among educators of diverse learners was disproportionately low before the pandemic. And special educators were not only more likely to leave the field than gen ed counterparts, they were more likely to leave it sooner. And now, well, you all can tell me what's going on right now, right? The emotional lives of teachers continues to be devastating. And we saw this pattern just 2 weeks into the pandemic, 19 months ago. More than 5,000 educators reported feeling anxious and fearful, worried, overwhelmed, and sad. Anxiety, by far, tend to be the most frequently mentioned emotions. And when we drill down deeper and look at what's happening now, we find that although general educators are still talking about the anxiety, special educators are feeling overwhelmed. And ESPs, they're telling us they're frustrated. Now, speaking of ESPs, did you know that education support professionals, ESPs, they make up a third of the entirety of the education workforce? That's estimated at just over 2 million staff. Now, in my work prior to COVID, I had been continuously struck by the lack of acknowledgement at scale of ESPs. So our education support professionals are often the most proximal service provider to our highest need learners, or they're the individuals in our school communities who have the greatest amount of contact with the entire student body during highly social times, such as the ride to and from school, during lunch, at recess, between classes. Overlooking ESPs and the equation of success for students is a massive missed opportunity. So we know that emotions matter, but speaking of representation, measurement matters too. We must consider what and how and who we are measuring and what the results really mean in the context of the learning environment. So, for example, a review of student diversity characteristics within universal SEL interventions through 2008 found that student disability status was rarely reported, and when it was used as an exclusionary criteria, right? Such exclusions do not account for the upwards of 60% of students serviced under IDEA. So remember when I said before, it's probable that most students with learning differences are being serviced by SEL interventions. The fact of the matter is, like, we really don't know yet. Well, you can't have evidence-based practice without evidence. And towards this end, despite the increased attention and spending and inclusion of SEL across schools and districts and standards, the ever-growing evidence reporting positive effects of SEL on student academic and non-cognitive outcomes is neither representative nor generalizable to the entirety of the student population and the teachers who educate them. And frankly, we should really do something. And we can, and we will do more, we will do better, we will do everything necessary to increase the provision of evidence-based SEL for all of our students who stand to benefit. And this is in essence the empirical heart of my research agenda. My work over the past decade has slowly been building a model of SEL assessment and intervention in traditionally underserved student and teacher populations. I'll note that it's taken me nearly a decade to get here. Along the way with my colleagues after building a careful applied science base for SEL in self-contained classrooms. So students who fall below the threshold for mainstream inclusion, primarily youth with emotion and behavior disorders, those serviced in alternative, therapeutic, and sub-separate educational settings. So all of the kiddos who tick the box for the exclusion criteria. Speaking of exclusion, let me tell you a little bit about what we currently know in the evidence for students with learning differences in SEL. My team is conducting an updated meta meta-analysis of the K-12 USB SEL interventions. This is for any of you who like to nerd out in the audience. This is the next generation of the seminal paper by Durlak and colleagues from 2011 in Child Development. You can find our pre-registration on the link on the slide here, and all of our info is up and free on Open Science Framework. Now, along the way, we reviewed 242 studies of SEL in our elementary schools in the US from 2008 to the end of 2020, right? So what do we know as of 2020? More than 75% of all studies make no mention whatsoever of students with disabilities. Fewer than 1 in 10 include students with disabilities in their analyses. Nearly 75% of studies do not report on student race in their results. Only 1 of every 10 reports on how students with different racial and ethnic identities are impacted by SEL. Also, our review reflected since 2008, we only have evidence for 9 SEL programs that provide outcome data for students with disabilities or among diverse racial and ethnic groups, and Ruler is not one of them. Our systematic review further revealed that although most studies don't actively exclude students with disabilities, so only 4%, most studies don't include them either, right? So we know we shouldn't exclude, but we haven't actively gotten to the place of inclusion. And speaking of visibility, we also found evidence of inconsistent, incomplete, and very worrisome labeling practices for student race and ethnicity. So, for example, some studies reported on subgroups of students where teachers assigned student racial categories, right? Or they said things like white or non-white, or percentage minority with no indication of the racial or ethnic makeup. These problematic practices mute the presentation of diversity and cultural backgrounds and identities in our science. Now, 16 years ago, prevention science set forth to establish a best practice, right, to promote guidance around the definition of who is in our studies and how we do evidence-based practice. And as of 2020, more than a third of the studies in our sample fail to meet the minimum reporting standard for race and ethnicity, and there is still no minimum reporting standard for disability. Prevention Science, the same journal where that minimum reporting standard was called out in 2005, emerged as the most frequent represented journal in our review. Limitations in the data available and difficulties in collecting the necessary data to support drawing meaningful conclusions for subgroups of students does not mean that because we did not, we should not, or we cannot. Effective January 2020, SRD enacted a sociocultural policy calling for the explicit consideration of generalizability of findings. Now, I am cautiously optimistic that these policies and those that have followed will begin to promote some positive change. However, let's be real. What constitutes theoretically relevant characteristics for research in SEL? Is any school or classroom so homogeneous that disability or race or ethnicity or language would ever be irrelevant to the successful implementation and study of a SEL intervention? Humans vary, and as such, researchers must intentionally and systematically attend to student variability in research design and analysis if we ever hope to equitably and inclusively reflect the experiences and outcomes of our marginalized youth in our evidence base. And in the absence of this evidence, we may, however unintentionally, perpetuate racism and ableism within SEL. Educational researchers are in part products of our training. We're situated within universities with long-standing precedences for methodology and policies of our employers and publishers and funders, right? Though racism and ableism, most often defined within a school community as a social prejudice or a discrimination directed at a person or people based on membership of a particular group, it is super important that we recognize that racism and ableism also involves one group having a power to systematically discriminate through these policies and practices of society. And I'm a researcher who sits in a position of privilege, of those who define the parameters within which youth are seen in the evidence base, and thus reflected within what's defined as best practice in the literature. Let's take a second and check on this. I think you're getting a vibe from me on how I'm feeling about it. How does it make you feel to learn of these gaps in the SEL evidence base. So a word or phrase in the question box. How does it make you feel to learn of these gaps in the evidence base? Amanda, could you support me?
Yes, go ahead and share your responses in the question box, and they will come in just a minute here.
Thank you.
We're getting a lot of questions too about additional resources, and I'm sure you'll share at the end of your presentation.
Yeah.
We do have a response that says frustrated, overlooked, ignored, very concerned, angry. I appreciate you uncovering this for me, never considered it. Perspective matters, scared, overwhelmed, discouraged, concerned, angry, upset. Supportive, frustrated, a lot of frustration out there.
Yeah, I hear you. There is a lot to be frustrated about, and as my research team will attest, when we started this journey a couple of years ago doing these updated lit reviews, we did not realize we were stepping into the Grand Canyon. We knew it would be bad, but we didn't know it was going to be this bad. So let's talk a little bit about what we're doing about it. So far, I've been talking a lot about the literature. Let's dig in now and think about the content of SEL, right? So what can we do about this? So to start, what does variability in emotion look like in your classroom? So let's take a minute to consider you have a learner with a learning disability. By the time a student with LD reaches upper elementary school, they may have had significant experiences of failure and frustration as a consequence of the mismatch of the needs and the strengths and kinds of instruction supported that they've encountered at school. And actually, about half of learners will have reported by this age feeling stigmatized and isolated. Some students with LD will also, as a consequence of their disability or lack of access to curriculum, have difficulty with both intra and interpersonal skills, including difficulties in social relationships, as well as recognizing and managing emotions. And as a result, they may be more likely to evaluate, feel, and manage the feedback situation, like the one I was describing earlier, with an overwhelming and intense negative emotion. So recalling prior negative experiences about feedback where their needs weren't met. You could be at a loss about how you're going to connect with peers, and they might feel worried, angry, sad, or alone, right? The opposite of what we were describing further on how we want to make our students feel in our classrooms, how we want to support them to feel. And we know that managing these emotions and relationships in the moment are difficult for any student, but for students where emotion regulation and interpersonal relationships can be a challenge, this experience may actually feel insurmountable. Is it any wonder that students who are more likely to disengage from or ignore feedback from teachers or worse, act out or recede and internalize in attempts to defray attention from the difficulty they may be experiencing? We often say that student behavior reflects useful information to support teacher instructional decision-making. I implore you to think about that as student emotion, right? Student emotion is providing us with useful information to support our instructional decision-making. So to do SEL for all learners well, we need to consider the barriers that students might experience. And I'm recognizing with I appreciate the note on timing that I am not going to get to all of this that I wanted to today. And so what I will note is that we have, over the past couple of years, simultaneously as interrogating the evidence base, been looking at SEL programs and approaches to identify key barriers that are laden across the SEL landscape and generating a library of resources and support for educators to help to overcome those barriers. And so we have 4 big dimensions, and I'll go through a couple of them high level, but make sure and note that you're going to get tons of resources after this because all my science is free and publicly available, and I look forward to supporting you. So let's talk about what we found, right? We know our students vary and how they are, and they're perceptually or sensorily diverse. They may be blind, low vision, hearing impaired, deaf. They will be negatively impacted by a narrow design that privileges a single representation above all else. Similarly, a student who has limited background knowledge or prior experience with a particular model will also experience a barrier to learning. And in addition, learning experience that provide for limited means of navigating or physical interaction will create barriers for students who have a physical disability, a language or speech or sound disorder. right? Or those who have differing expectations and social norms about how learning should be navigated. So, for example, let's take a look at the mood meter. Right, so this is the mood meter from Ruler. Students use this as a tool to map how much energy is in their body and how pleasant or unpleasant they feel. And then they choose an emotion word that best reflects the feeling. Now, the mood meter has been found to be a really powerful tool to support students to make abstract feelings concrete and self-monitor their emotions. Yet, if the mood meter is only available visually, it can be a barrier to many. So we can think about tactile adaptation for students, so rendering it digitally so that it can be flexibly changed in size to represent and meet the needs of others. Physical representations could be concurrently offered to present each quadrant in a way that's different by touch or light. So high energy, unpleasant could be represented as rough or coarse material. Low energy or pleasant could be represented as smooth or soft. Teachers can also create multiple activities about the mood meter, right? So they can support students to act out an emotion word and feelings, take advantage of opportunities to connect body feelings with those words that might help, may sometimes, especially for our youngest students, be abstract to connect on. I also just want to make note that it's really important that we understand that some barriers that our learners experience are hidden from view. So processing speed, excuse me, for example, processing speed can pose a significant challenge for students when a lesson or activity is done in person on a class-wide timetable and through Discourse, right? To more flexibly support students and have cognitive accessibility and thus to process the information at a pace best for them, we need to think about teacher monitored class blogging, digital chat sessions outside of class time as ways for students to share, to think, to question, and to give us their insights on their own time scale. This kind of strategy will also support students who face barriers to self-regulation with face-to-face conversations and to become more fully engaged in SEL. Of course, repetition and revisiting of social emotional concepts and vocabulary will always be helpful, right? Educators might, for example, implement an I'm noticing routine, where students are supported to practice noticing and cataloging their feelings without judgment. So developing awareness of feelings in one's body in connection with the word. So I noticed that I have a lot of positive energy in my body. I do. I feel excited, for example. Now, if you don't provide for supportive emotional conditions, right, or emotional accessibility, our students are much less likely to engage. And complicating matters, our students' emotional responses to learning vary widely, right? Varying based on personal and sociocultural influences. So, for example, cultural norms for individuals or collective experiences might make some learners feel negatively about solo or peer-to-peer or large group experiences. Students with difficulty reading might feel significantly overwhelmed and stressed in response to a text that is above their reading level. Or students might feel uncomfortable about an activity if the material used does not reflect something that's personally important to the aspects of their identity, which may include on the basis of gender, racial, ethnic, or others, resulting in reduced engagement, right, which leads to comprehension and or participation. And cultural differences may shape the likelihood of students attending to different emotional cues and the strategies that they're going to call on to regulate these emotions. And for these reasons, lack of attention to emotional accessibility of SEL experiences can really dangerously introduce an unintentional and negative bias, reinforcing the separation and isolation that many of our marginalized students already are feeling at school. So we need to design for emotional accessibility. We need to be proactive and consider the range of human variability in social emotional knowledge, skills, and prior experience. That needs to be the norm and not the exception. And flexible supports and scaffolds, options that reflect social emotional needs and strengths of all students can be built into the core curriculum and not provided as an add-on for students. So You could, for example, just like noting time here, think about emotion right along the side of cognition as you work to implement the SEL in an area goal. So maybe you frame the goal as students will be able to recognize their emotions in math, or students will be able to experience self-efficacy, creating and selecting research topics, or students will demonstrate honesty and integrity. When our learners sense they feel like they belong here, they believe they can do this, their sense of self-efficacy increases, persistently increases in fact, and becomes more successful in both their academic and their SEL skill development. As I mentioned before, our kiddos are constantly evaluating their learning environment and checking in on how they're feeling, and not just how, but why. It's going to be a key scaffold to support them in understanding how they may want to change the way they're feeling to better support their learning and growth and be available in the learning environment. And in addition, having students map their emotions throughout the day to see how their emotions are changing can be really powerful at increasing their self-awareness, as well as be really important information for you as the educator to best support that student's growth and learning. Now, the third barrier, text, language, and discourse, right? The semantic elements through which we present implementation in SEL, right? The words, the symbols, the numbers, the icons, differentially accessible, right? They vary based on your background, competencies, language, lexical knowledge. And you may be surprised to know that in the US, an extraordinary number of our students are not proficient readers. So 66% of 12th graders in the US read at or below basic, so non-proficient for grade level. 31% read below basic. And in general, text is really limiting in presenting information and reinforcing big ideas, and yet text and language and discourse, key formats in SEL. So we need to provide access to supporting the use of understanding emotion language and vocabulary, right? We know this is important within SEL, and educators can consider a wide range of scaffolds to aid in the reinforcement of vocabulary, comprehension, expression, and support the development of emotional intelligence in SEL. So to ensure accessibility, key social emotional vocabulary, labels, and icons and symbols, they need to be associated with an alternative representation of meaning, right? And in addition, consider the use of assistive technology. Listening comprehension should be supported, and when conveying information, representing the text should be prioritized through multiple forms. Generally speaking, promoting the use of relevant alternatives is helpful, such as using emotion facial displays, so emojis, right, or bitmojis, and tactile options to represent feelings. I do want to draw an important note here that emotion facial displays vary culturally, and that variability should not be understood, variability should be understood and honored, and rather it is not okay to just correct the changing of skin color when trying to create and use these emotion representations. So we really need to be very careful here because there are some slippery slopes that are free and publicly available. Educators can introduce abstract feelings and words using materials such as colors and textures and images to build with students what these words mean and feel like, and also creating opportunities to bring in families to help to support in cultural variability and connection. So learning what the emotion words mean in their family's native language, learning what the feeling words mean culturally, and evolving the classroom lexicon to embrace and support and utilize all of these different meanings. It's acknowledging and affirming how our students are engaging and learning in their social emotional development. And lastly, the last barrier that we had was executive functioning, which I'm sure comes as no surprise when thinking about how we need to support and scaffold students. And we know that we can support our students through the co-creation of goals together. So the co-creation of related accessible resources, such as many schools have, maybe your school has one, a calming area, a quiet area, a safe space. Maybe our students are utilizing a 3-ring book with goals and tools. Co-creation supports access and helps students to learn and use strategies through the process of project-based learning. And strengthening awareness of the connection of SEL and academic goals by goal setting together with students and academics combined can have students thinking about what they might need from their peers and teachers to help them meet their academic and SEL goals simultaneously. Supporting students to track their own progress is also a very helpful way to move forward in this regard. So I'm going to skip this check-in to just provide us with a couple of quick notes on thinking about these potential barriers and what we can do moving forward to conclude our time together today. So as we know, we've been coming to grips with the structural historical drivers of inequity and systems of oppression that have been maintained through systemic discrimination in our society. And I implore you to think about how we can heal and create sustainable change toward eradicating these inequities while controlling the spread of COVID-19. We know that many educators unintentionally and unconsciously adopt bias and deficit-based thinking that's embedded in systems. We must begin by interrogating our position and building self and social awareness in the forms of racism and ableism and how they're linked to privilege and dehumanizing perceptions of others. We can educate ourselves about how discrimination and bias and racism may shape our lives, consider who and how gets to define what is best for your students and for your teachers, and what students and teachers are held up as best in your school community. We can actively listen and understand and honor all feelings. Remind our students that we have our emotions for a reason. Teachers and parents can support students to process these current events, as well as the personal impact of the traumas related to the pandemic and systemic racism, ableism, discrimination, and bias more broadly. We really need to let our students be our guides here. Adults must discuss these challenging and changing experiences in our schools. Our kids are learning from us, right? Our actions and inaction will define their future. And we need to discuss these challenges as a school community, creating space for discourse about a range of challenging topics, right? When we have conversations about challenging topics, our young people learn that they can come to the adults around them and or to take direct action against the injustice, right? The challenging times that we're living in, there is no better time than now to start engaging in these conversations, right? Just because we have not or we should or we think we cannot does not mean that we should not. And we also know that this disparate experiences of the pandemic have required attention to the needs of the individual learner in a context of a broader system of supports. And although it may feel like so much of this has been out of our control right now, we can choose to stake our agency in making decisions that are in the best interest of all learners and families, and hear and preserve all voices in the process, right? How can we actively work to create systems and schools that reflect everyone? Social emotional training and skills are critical for starting to hold that safe, difficult, constructive conversations and begin to promote real action. We know that SEL has played an important role in the past 3 decades of research and practice, where I started off today, in the service of our psychosocial well-being for all students and teachers. Although we are still uncovering, as I mentioned, for who, how, and why SEL matters, I believe we are closer than we've ever been to a truly representative and generalizable SEL evidence base. SEL has been playing a leading role in the promotion of wellness during COVID-19, and when implemented systematically and equitably as part of a broader system of supports, it can positively impact the evolving needs of our communities now and hereafter. The ambiguities of the time, the structural inequities that they continue to emphasize, alongside mounting socio-political unrest and deepening divisiveness across our nation, requires immediate, intentional, and preventative action. We must be both systematic and systemic with quality SEL implementation. We need to use our creativity and what we've been learning in real time, like right now, to apply SEL to our teaching and learning. We must invest in training and ongoing support for all of our educators and leaders and administrators in partnership with families and community partners. We must harness our social awareness to dismantle the pervasive racism and ableism and restore commitments to each other. And we must make the responsible decision to learn through this reality. We need to interrogate and evolve SEL towards the meaningful inclusion of all of our learners and educators towards a truly responsive support for all school communities hereafter. And I contend our teachers, our students' ability to thrive personally, socially, and academically, it really does depend on it. And so with that, we have hopefully a couple of minutes left for questions. I leave you with this question to sit with on what you're going to do tomorrow, or for those of you who are on the West Coast and still at school, what are you going to do today? And so thank you all so much for hanging on for this talk today. Thank you, Amanda.
Wow, Dr. Cipriano, what an inspirational talk. Beyond words. We're getting a lot of amazing feedback in the question box and just a lot of thank yous and appreciation. They were asking about resources, so a couple questions about adult SEL in particular. So maybe if you want to talk about some of the resources and the survey as well, and then we might have time for one more question.
Yeah, absolutely. So in follow-up, you'll be getting a link to a live Google Doc that I'll share that will have links to resources that my team and I have developed over the past couple of years, material that's free and publicly available, and as well as ongoing research studies to help to support you in navigating the social emotional conditions in your classrooms, recognizing barriers and access points for your students that are embedded within your SEL programming or way curriculum is structured at the district level, and how we can help to support you to work through those together in the co-construction of meaningful learning. In addition, I did want to acknowledge, thank you, Amanda, for raising it, about the survey, and I want to thank all of you that did take the time to fill out the survey. I didn't have enough participation at this point to be able to share results with you all today above and beyond the high level ones I shared at the beginning of anxiety, the experiences of anxiety and feeling overwhelmed. However, if you would like to take that survey after the talk, I am going to leave it open for a couple of days, and I know that our colleagues here at Harmony will go ahead and share those results out with the community thereafter.
Thank you so much. There were quite a few questions about middle school and high school students. Maybe you could just take a minute. And there was a question in particular about, well, if they haven't had SEL in elementary school, and obviously so much trauma right now with older students after the pandemic and as the pandemic goes on. So what is your advice to supporting middle and high school students in authentic ways?
Absolutely. Well, there's no better time to start than now, right? And even when we think about our adults, just because you haven't had training or support previously does not mean that we don't start right now with opening up and taking the time to talk about how we're feeling and why. That's our first step in developing self-awareness, which tends to be the precursor for our additional, more sophisticated emotional intelligence skills. What is most important is that we know that SEL skills don't develop in a vacuum. It's through the co-regulation of the environment. So it's with their peers, their adults, their teachers, as well as their parents and families as guides, and moving through that continual learning. And so looking to guides and resources that programs like ours and yours and others offer will provide conversation starters and places to begin to engage in that discussion. I do want to note, however, that you need to be prepared that when you open up a conversation on how do you feel and you start to ask a student why, you need to be ready for the follow-up. Right? And so we need to be ready for the follow-up, because if not, we are not affirming that student in their identity and where they are, and we're not using it as information, and that's when we can fall down that slippery slope to being disadvantageous to the learner.
Well, great response there. Well, I know there's many more questions, so it's an opportunity for our audience to reach out to you. Your email is here, your social media handle is here. We so appreciate your time, your insights today. Do you have any closing thoughts for our audience, for our teachers today?
I just want to thank you all so much. I'm really blown away at the response midday on a Thursday, joining for this talk today. And so I do welcome the opportunity for additional support. And if you are looking for something that's more formalized in support, our center did develop a free course on managing emotions in times of uncertainty and stress. That's up. That link is also up right now on your screen, offered through Coursera. And it will walk through some of the skills and strategy development at the adult level. And so that's free to all educators in the country and will be open. I'm told it's through the end of this school year now. So we're staying open through into 2022. So through the end of the 21-22 school year.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cipriano.
Thank you.
We were thrilled to have you here today. We want to invite you, as this webinar comes to a close, to remind you that we have amazing opportunities as well through Harmony for your SEL practices to be brought to your community. So feel free to register for our free weekly trainings, and you can use the QR code on your screen to sign up. And we look forward to helping you recharge your SEL implementation practices that we've talked about today. As this webinar comes to a close, on the next slide, please.
Oh, it's doing that thing again.
It knows it's the end of the webinar. Well,
Well,
as this
at least it didn't do it throughout, right? So
yes, yes. As this webinar comes to a close, you will see a brief survey that pops up on your screen. We greatly appreciate you taking the time to fill out the survey. To this day, all of your responses have helped us plan better webinars in the future. We also encourage you to follow us on social media and share about your responses to this amazing webinar today. Thank you all for joining us. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.
thank you.